A 32-year-old police officer ventured into the Rocky Mountains for a short solo hike, seeking the kind of solitude she often said kept her grounded, but she never returned. Despite an intensive search that scoured ridgelines and valleys, her trail vanished as if swallowed by the wilderness itself. For years, all that remained were scattered belongings, rumors, and silence, until investigators uncovered a memory card hidden in her shoe, a desperate clue she had left behind. That same morning, far from the timberline, the Fort Collins Police Department gathered for their 8 a.m. shift briefing. The room was filled with officers checking their duty logs, a space defined by order and routine. But when Officer Claire Hensley's name was called, it was met with nothing but silence. Known for her discipline, reliability, and tactical precision, she was the last person anyone expected to miss roll call. Her unexplained absence was more than a breach of duty. It was the first chilling sign that something was terribly wrong. Claire was not the kind of officer to vanish. She was meticulous. The one colleagues teased for carrying redundant maps and triple-checking her patrol assignments. Hiking alone in the mountains wasn't unusual for her. In fact, it was a ritual, a way of reconnecting with herself after the weight of the badge grew heavy. But this time, something about her absence felt different. It wasn't just a hiker overdue. It was a silence that rippled with dread. When calls to her phone went unanswered, her colleagues tried to dismiss it as a scheduling miscommunication. Maybe she had taken a few extra days of personal leave. But by midday, unease hardened into alarm. Officers contacted her parents, Daniel and Ruth Hensley, who confirmed she had mentioned a weekend trip into Rocky Mountain National Park, but gave no details beyond a short solo hike. She hadn't specified the trail, the duration, or her exact destination, habits that usually came second nature to her. That omission alone was enough to raise eyebrows. By that evening, the first search team was dispatched. Rangers and volunteers fanned out along the popular trailheads, scanning parking lots for her vehicle. They found it at the base of Glacier Creek Trail, locked, neatly parked, no signs of forced entry. Inside were small personal items, but no hiking pack. Claire had gone into the wilderness with her gear. She simply hadn't come back. The next 72 hours blurred into a storm of helicopters, search dogs, and desperate radio chatter. The terrain was punishing, jagged ridges cutting into dense forests, weather swinging unpredictably between late summer warmth and early fall frost. Hundreds of searchers combed the area, shouting her name into the wind. Nothing answered back. On the fifth day, Hannah Cole, a local hiker who had volunteered with the search, stumbled across something just off the marked trail. It was a hiking pole, weathered and worn, lodged between boulders. Nearby lay fragments of a tent and a ripped backpack strap. The gear looked abandoned rather than neatly packed away, as if scattered in haste or desperation. Volunteers reported the find immediately, but the trail led nowhere. No footprints, no blood, no body, just belongings lying in silence. The official search stretched into weeks. Each day the search grid widened, but each day yielded only disappointment. Finally, as snow began to creep down the higher peaks, operations scaled back. Claire was declared missing, presumed dead. The wilderness had claimed her, just as it had so many before. But for her family, for her colleagues, and for the searchers who had walked those ridgelines, something about the case never sat right. Claire was too careful, too experienced to simply vanish. And then there was the gear. The way it had been found didn't match a simple accident. It felt wrong, staged even, though no one could say why. Her parents refused to accept the official conclusion. Daniel and Ruth Hensley printed flyers, gave interviews, begged for information. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The trail went cold. Rumors swirled that she had run away, that she had been targeted because of her badge, that she had simply made a fatal misstep. None of them fit the Claire they knew. It might have ended there, just another unsolved disappearance in the Rockies. But years later, during a routine cold case review, one investigator would stumble upon a detail hidden in the bureaucracy of her training records, a detail that would pull the case back from the void and unravel a truth darker than anyone could have imagined. The wilderness had not swallowed Claire Hensley. A man had, and this is only the beginning. What happened to Claire Hensley isn't just a story of one woman. It's a chilling reminder how the wilderness can hide more than just shadows. If you want to follow every twist, every clue, and every unsettling reveal, make sure to subscribe. Because the answers don't come easy in cases like this, and you won't want to miss what comes next. When the search for Claire Hensley was officially suspended, the word struck her parents like a death sentence delivered without a body. Daniel sat in the family's living room, his hands trembling as he held a folded letter from the Park Service, a letter that reduced his daughter to statistics. Area covered, volunteer hours expended, probability of survival minimal. It was a bureaucratic obituary. For Ruth, the silence was worse than any official pronouncement. She kept her daughter's phone plugged into the wall long after service was suspended, staring at the black screen as if willing it to light up with a message. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm coming home." But it never did. The mountain had a way of swallowing people. That much was true. Rangers often spoke of the wilderness as both magnificent and merciless. But for those who knew Claire, the explanation of an accident felt thin, even insulting. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. She had spent her life preparing for worst-case scenarios. To vanish without a trace? To leave nothing but fragments of gear? It didn't fit. In the weeks that followed, her fellow officers formed search parties of their own. Off-duty men and women strapped on boots, scoured ridgelines, retraced creek beds. They weren't just looking for a colleague. They were looking for answers. But every lead ended in silence. By November, snow buried the high country. Trails iced over. The search impossible. The official file closed with the chilling words, "Presumed deceased." For the department, it was closure on paper. For the Hensleys, it was a wound that refused to scar. Ruth began carrying Claire's badge in her purse everywhere she went, rubbing her thumb against the worn edges whenever panic surged. Daniel withdrew into himself, spending long evenings on the porch staring toward the mountains, as if Sherwood could summon her back. Their home became a shrine of unanswered questions. Flyers with her photograph, dark hair, steady eyes, uniform pressed with pride, remained taped to the refrigerator long after the ink had begun to fade. Visitors would stop by with food, but conversations always ended the same way. "Do you think she could still be out there?" The community rallied at first. Candlelight vigils were held, prayers whispered, petitions written to reopen the search. But as the seasons turned, so did people's attention. Other stories rose in headlines. Other tragedies demanded space. The silence around Claire thickened. And then came the rumors. Some whispered that she had chosen to disappear, that the pressure of the badge had broken her spirit. Others speculated she had been targeted, that her work as an officer had made her enemies. A darker faction even suggested she had been involved in something illicit, and that her disappearance was her escape. None of it was true, but once speculation takes root, it grows like ivy through cracks, suffocating truth with possibility. For Daniel and Ruth, the whispers were salt in an open wound. They clung to what they knew. Claire had loved her work, had loved the mountains, and had loved them. She hadn't run away. Something had happened to her out there. 2 years later, in the summer of 2017, a break seemed to emerge, though not the one they hoped for. A local woman named Ellen Wilder was bushwhacking near a stream on the park's western edge when she stumbled upon what looked like weather-beaten camping gear. A half-collapsed tent, its poles bent. A cooking pot rusted through. A section of nylon backpack strap frayed, as if torn. At first she thought it was simply abandoned junk, but then she noticed the initials etched into the underside of the pot. She called it in. Rangers returned to the site and cataloged the items. They were indeed Claire's. The family's hope reignited briefly, like a candle in the wind. Maybe she had left more behind. Maybe her body was near. But searches around the area revealed nothing. No human remains. No camera. Just the gear, as if it had been scattered deliberately. Theories spun again. Did she flee something? Did she collapse and animals drag her body away? Or had someone else planted the items to mislead? Investigators found no answers. To them, the gear was both revelation and taunt. Proof she had made it farther into the wilderness than expected, yet no closer to explaining why she never came back. The Hensleys latched onto the detail of the pot. Claire had always etched her initials into her gear. "She left this for us," Ruth whispered one night, clutching the report. She wanted to be found. But found she was not. As 2018 began, the case teetered on the edge of being forgotten altogether. Another cold file gathering dust in the archives of unsolved disappearances. The mountain had claimed her. The official story was complete, or so it seemed, because deep within those archives, a young investigator would stumble on a name buried in old police academy records. A name that would unravel everything the wilderness had hidden. A name that suggested Claire's disappearance was not an accident of nature, but a crime of man. The silence that had haunted the Hensleys for nearly 3 years was about to shatter. In the dim light of a cluttered file room, Detective Aaron Mercer shuffled through forgotten corners of the Fort Collins Police Department's archives. He wasn't new to cold cases. In fact, he built a reputation for chasing ghosts through paper trails, but there was something about Claire Hensley's file that had never left him. Most cold cases read like unfinished stories. Claire's was different. It wasn't just unfinished. It was jagged, like someone had deliberately ripped out the final pages. Mercer knew the statistics. Hikers vanished in the Rockies all the time. Some fell into hidden crevices. Others were swept away by rivers. Still others became victims of sudden weather shifts. But when he read through Claire's reports, something gnawed at him. The gear scattered unnaturally, the silence around her disappearance, the lack of a body despite extensive search grids. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. So, late one evening, he dug into the department's internal training records, a tedious task most detectives would have avoided. If Claire had been so prepared, where had she trained? Who had taught her survival in the wild? That's when he found it. In 2012, Claire had attended a specialized wilderness survival course required for officers who frequently worked in remote terrain. The course had been subcontracted to a private company, one that offered advanced backcountry skills to law enforcement. Mercer flipped the page, his eyes catching on a name written in ink at the bottom of the roster. Elias Crow. The name meant nothing to him at first, but as he cross-referenced it with old personnel notes, his pulse quickened. Crow was a certified instructor at the time, a man with glowing reviews from trainees. Yet, just months after the course, his certification had been revoked without explanation. Buried in the footnotes of a report was a vague line, instructor dismissed for inappropriate conduct. Mercer leaned back in his chair. The air in the archive room seemed to thicken. Why had this name never surfaced before? He dug deeper. Court records showed that Crow had once been arrested for assault during a wilderness retreat in Oregon. The charges were dropped. Witnesses refused to testify. But the pattern was there. A man who knew the wild, who charmed his students, but who carried shadows behind the charisma. Mercer began pulling photographs. Elias Crow was ruggedly handsome, with sharp features and the kind of presence that could command a room. He carried himself like someone who belonged to the mountains more than society. To the untrained eye, he looked like a guide, a mentor. To Mercer, he looked like opportunity dressed as trust. The detective's next step was subtle. He requested old interviews from Claire's colleagues about the training. Buried in the transcripts was an offhand comment from another officer. Crow had a way of singling people out. He liked to test you, see how far you go before breaking. Some called it motivational. Others called it cruel. It was enough to unsettle Mercer. He knew predators often disguised cruelty as mentorship, and predators who understood the wilderness could make people vanish without leaving behind more than a whisper. But suspicion wasn't proof. He needed more. Mercer spent weeks reconstructing Claire's final known timeline. Cell tower pings placed her vehicle near Glacier Creek. Her last debit card transaction showed a purchase as Small Gear Shop 2 towns over, an extra pack of trail mix, a fresh pair of laces. Nothing unusual, except the shopkeeper remembered something. She wasn't alone, the man told Mercer. She came in with a guy, tall, kind of intense eyes. Looked like one of those survivalist types. Didn't say much. She paid for her things and left, but he lingered a bit, asking about remote trail conditions. The shopkeeper shrugged. I thought maybe they were together. Mercer's stomach tightened. He showed the man a photo lineup, and without hesitation, the shopkeeper pointed to Elias Crow. The first thread had been pulled. From there, Mercer petitioned for surveillance footage from highway cameras leading toward the trailhead. Most of it was grainy, useless. But on one frame, time-stamped the morning Claire disappeared, her car appeared, driving toward Glacier Creek. Just behind it, at a distance that suggested intent, was another vehicle, a dusty green pickup registered to Elias Crow. The discovery sent a chill through Mercer. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. He compiled the evidence, the training connection, the dismissed certification, the eyewitness from the gear shop, the trailing vehicle. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough to bring Crow under a microscope. When Mercer ran a background check, his unease deepened. Crow had no fixed address. He drifted from town to town, often near national forests. His employment was seasonal, guiding trips, teaching survival skills under different aliases. On forums dedicated to backcountry enthusiasts, his name appeared in hushed tones. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. The more Mercer read, the clearer it became. Elias Crow didn't just live in the wilderness. He thrived in the spaces where law and order grew thin. Mercer closed the file that night with a whisper only he could hear. This isn't the mountain's doing. This is his. What he didn't know was that unraveling Elias Crow's life would not only expose the truth about Claire Hensley, but also plunge him into a game of predator and prey, one that would test how far a man like Crow could bend the wilderness to his will. The next step would not be research. It would be confrontation. By 2017, the name Claire Hensley had nearly faded from public conversation. The missing person posters had been taken down, the vigils had dwindled to a handful of mourners, and the park rangers moved on to other rescues and recoveries. To the public, her case was just another tragic wilderness disappearance swallowed by the Rockies. But within the walls of the Fort Collins Police Department, the weight of her absence lingered like a permanent shadow. That's when Detective Aaron Mercer was assigned to review the case files. Mercer was not the type to be deterred by dusty binders or years of dead ends. He had built a reputation for approaching cases sideways, ignoring the obvious trails everyone else followed, preferring to dig where no one thought to look. Where most investigators saw stacks of dead paperwork, Mercer saw potential patterns, faint threads that others had dismissed. The case file was overwhelming. Thousands of pages of search reports, ranger interviews, GPS logs, and even weather records. Mercer spent weeks absorbing it all, drinking stale coffee under the dim light of his cubicle. He noticed something. Nearly all of the early investigation had focused outward on the wilderness itself. Terrain models, search grids, helicopter sweeps. The mountain had been treated as the prime suspect. Mercer wondered, what if the answer wasn't the mountain but in Claire's life? He began retracing her career, digging through police academy records, specialized training programs, and personnel evaluations. To most, these files were bureaucratic noise. To Mercer, they were uncharted ground. That's when he found something unusual. Years earlier, Claire had taken an advanced course on wilderness tactical operations. The course was designed for law enforcement operating in remote regions, survival skills, navigation, tracking. But what struck Mercer was not the syllabus. It was the instructors, civilian contractors, survivalists, mountaineers, guides, outsiders brought in to teach police officers how to survive in places like Rocky Mountain National Park. Mercer began compiling a list of those contractors. Most were scattered across the country, long retired or working in other states. But buried in the archive rosters was a name that gave him pause: Elias Crow. Crow wasn't just any instructor. He was a respected wilderness guide operating out of Estes Park, a man known for taking tourists into areas far off the marked trails. He'd occasionally consulted for law enforcement on backcountry rescues, making him trusted in both communities. He hadn't taught Claire directly, but his name appeared in the broader contractor database linked to the course she attended. It was a thin thread, but Mercer tugged at it. When he cross-checked Crow's background, the sheen of respectability peeled away. Crow carried a violent history. 15 years earlier, he had been convicted of aggravated robbery, a felony that landed him in prison for a decade. Officially, he was a man who had paid his debt and rebuilt himself. But to Mercer, the idea of a convicted felon quietly working as a wilderness guide with the skills and knowledge to disappear in terrain like this, was alarming. Mercer's mind returned to the one fragile lead from the early days. Hannah Cole's brief, retracted sighting at the High Alpine Lodge. A man with a weathered face, confident and charismatic. Speaking to Claire, the description wasn't a perfect match, but it wasn't far off either. He ran Crow's name against incident reports from the park. A disturbing pattern emerged. Crow was frequently seen in areas far from the main trails, often in the same sectors where the initial search teams had concentrated. His guiding business often took clients to hidden caves and overlooks that most tourists never knew existed. The pieces began to click. Mercer didn't see Claire as a random victim of the wilderness anymore. He saw her as a woman who had crossed paths with the wrong man, someone who could charm his way into her trust, lead her into the deep backcountry, and vanish without leaving a trace. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Mercer knew that if he moved too quickly, Crow could vanish into the very wilderness he commanded. To catch him, they would need precision. They would need patience. They would need a plan that left no chance for escape. Mercer quietly escalated his findings to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. For the first time in 2 years, the case that everyone thought was unsolvable was alive again. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation took Mercer's findings seriously, but cautiously. Claire Hensley's case had already consumed thousands of man-hours. To reopen it on the strength of one investigator's hunch seemed risky. Yet the name Elias Crow lingered in the air like smoke. It couldn't be ignored. Mercer and 2 federal analysts began a deeper dive into Crow's past. On the surface, he appeared to be a model citizen. His guiding company, Mountain Vale Tours, had glowing reviews online. Visitors praised his charisma, his encyclopedic knowledge of the Rockies, and his ability to lead people into places that felt untouched by time. He was more than a guide to his clients. He was an adventurer, a storyteller, a man who belonged to the mountain. But underneath, the cracks showed. His aggravated robbery conviction had been buried in sealed court records, accessible only to law enforcement databases. Mercer pulled a file and read the details with a cold unease. A violent incident outside a Denver pawn shop in 1999. Crow and 2 accomplices had pistol-whipped the owner during a botched robbery. 10 years behind bars. Released in 2009. By 2012, he was reinvented as a wilderness guide. That transformation struck Mercer as too clean, too convenient. Men like Crow didn't just shed a decade of violence like a snake shedding its skin. They carried it with them. Digging deeper, Mercer found something else. Crow wasn't simply leading tours. He had carved out a reputation for taking people off-grid. He marketed himself as the man who could show you the Rockies the way few ever saw them. Secluded caves, hidden valleys, trails that didn't exist on maps. That single detail made Mercer's pulse quicken. The metadata from Claire's hidden SD card pointed to a cave system miles from the main trail. And Elias Crow was one of the only guides with documented knowledge of those same caverns. The investigators went further, combing through client logs, cross-referencing dates, and tour schedules. Most of it was benign, vacationers from Texas or college students seeking thrills. But one log in particular caught Mercer's eye, September 2015, the same month Claire vanished. That week, Crow had blocked out his calendar. No tours listed. No explanations given. Just blank days in the middle of his otherwise meticulous schedule. Mercer's instincts hardened into certainty. The question was not whether Crow had crossed paths with Claire. The question was how. Hannah Cole's shaky statement now loomed larger than ever. She had described a man with confidence, a man who seemed to belong in the wilderness. At the time, investigators dismissed it as stress-induced confusion. But when Mercer placed her description side by side with Crow's booking photo, the resemblance was undeniable. The realization chilled him. They may have brushed past the answer years earlier, only to let it slip away. The Bureau began surveillance quietly. Crow was still leading private tours, guiding wealthy clients into the high passes. He was disciplined, careful. He paid his taxes, maintained his permits, and charmed every ranger he encountered. On the surface, there was nothing to hold him on. But Mercer knew that if they tipped their hand, Crow could vanish into the same wilderness where Claire disappeared. A decision was made. If they were going to move, it had to be done on his terrain, but under their control. A tactical team was assembled, officers with their own wilderness survival training, men and women capable of tracking in the backcountry without being seen. The operation would require patience, deception, and flawless timing. For Mercer, this was more than just an arrest. This was the first time in years Claire's name felt like more than a headline. It was alive again, pulsing through every decision, every calculation. And he knew one thing for certain. Elias Crow would not go quietly. The plan was bold, risky, maybe even reckless. But investigator Daniel Mercer knew it was the only way. If they knocked on Elias Crow's cabin door with a warrant, he would smell it coming and vanish into wilderness before they'd even park their trucks. Men like Crow didn't need roads. The Rocky Mountains were his refuge, his sanctuary, and his escape route. If he disappeared into those ridges, they might never see him again. So, the Bureau decided to meet him on his own ground. The operation was given a sterile name in the files, Operation Summit Vale. In practice, it was as close to a wilderness ambush as law enforcement could come. The team chosen for the job was handpicked, not ordinary city cops, but a tactical unit trained for rough country. Former Rangers, search and rescue veterans, a handful of officers who knew how to live off the land for days without support. Each of them understood the stakes. Approach too soon, and Crow would catch the scent of danger. Move too late, and another innocent tourist could vanish into mountain fog. Mercer rode with them into the high country in the early morning hours of June 2018. A helicopter dropped the team deep into the timberline, miles from the nearest paved road. The rotor wash whipped snowmelt into their eyes before the machine banked away, leaving behind only silence and the vast immensity of the Rockies. From that point on, it was all boots, breath, and patience. Crow was leading a private group of 3 clients on a multi-day trek through a lesser-known section of Rocky Mountain National Park. They were professionals from Chicago who had paid top dollar for what Crow advertised as an unfiltered encounter with the ancient bones of the earth. His route was perfect for the ambush. Narrow ridges, bottlenecks of granite, no side trails to slip away. For 2 days, the tactical team shadowed him. They hiked parallel ridgelines, keeping him just within binocular range. They saw him laughing with his clients, carrying their heavy gear without effort, pointing out valleys that seemed untouched since the Ice Age. To his paying customers, he was a dream guide. To Mercer, he was a predator hiding in plain sight. The nights were the worst. The team camped in silence, whispering over small maps by red flashlight glow. They could hear distant echoes of Crow's group, the crack of firewood, the faint laughter drifting over the wind. Mercer lay awake in his bivvy sack, staring at the stars and wondering if Claire Hensley had looked at those same constellations in her final hours. The thought of her alone in the dark, somewhere out there, made his resolve sharpened to steel. On the 3rd morning, their moment came. Crow's party reached a treacherous pass, a natural choke point with a trail narrowed to a ridge scarcely wider than a dining table, sheer cliffs plunging on either side. It was a perfect place. There was no sprinting away, no hidden goat path to vanish down. Just a straight line of rock, exposed to the sky. The tactical team moved quickly into position. 2 of them donned park ranger uniforms, their cover story rehearsed to perfection. A routine safety inspection citing increased bear activity in the area. Mercer's heart hammered as he watched the uniformed officers approach from the trailhead below, smiling like officials doing nothing more sinister than checking permits. Crow greeted them warmly, like a man who had nothing to fear. He handed over his laminated guide credentials, joked with his clients, even asked one of the supposed rangers if they'd drawn the short straw to be out here today. But as the minutes ticked on, the rangers gently maneuvered him away from the group, out of earshot. That was when the mask dropped. One moment he was smiling. The next his face froze as the officer's tone shifted. Calm professionalism replaced casual chatter. They told him he was under arrest for the disappearance of Claire Hensley. In seconds, they were on him. One officer wrenching his arms behind his back, the other snapping cuffs tight around his wrists. The transformation was shocking. The charisma, the outdoorsman's ease, gone in an instant. Crow's skin drained pale beneath his sun-darkened face as realization dawned. His clients, watching from the ridge, looked stunned, their laughter silenced, their cameras forgotten. Mercer emerged from cover just as the tactical team secured him. He locked eyes with Crow, and for a heartbeat, the wilderness guide stared back with something like contempt. Then he looked away, jaw tight, lips pressed in. The operation was over in less than 5 minutes. The clients were escorted safely down trail by park officials, still reeling from the revelation that their friendly guide had just been marched off in handcuffs. Meanwhile, Crow was extracted by helicopter, bound for a secure facility in Denver. But as Mercer watched the bird lift into the clouds, his chest didn't fill with triumph. Instead, he felt something colder, unease. Because capturing Elias Crow was only half the battle. Now came the interrogation, and the question that haunted every investigator who had ever touched Claire's file. Would he finally tell them what happened in those mountains 3 years earlier? Every time it feels like we're close to the truth, the trail twists in an unexpected direction. And the deeper we go, the darker the shadows become. If you don't want to miss where this path leads, every revelation, every chilling turn, make sure to subscribe. Because in cases like this, the answers don't come all at once, they arrive piece by unsettling piece. For 2 days, the tactical team shadowed Elias Crow and his group of clients. Keeping to the tree line, their movements invisible to the untrained eye, they had inserted quietly into the wilderness by helicopter at dawn. Their gear muted in color, their radios hushed with coded brevity. Every step had to be calculated. Crow was no ordinary suspect. He was a man who understood terrain the way most people understood their own homes. If he suspected he was being followed, he could vanish into the labyrinth of valleys and ridges, gone before anyone could blink. The agents were patient. They studied the group from a distance, noting Crow's rhythm. He walked at the front, telling stories in his confident baritone, pausing at scenic overlooks, his hands animated as he described geology, folklore, survival tricks. His clients adored him, hanging on every word. He looked every bit the charismatic guide, the man of the mountain. But to the tactical team, he was something else entirely, a predator in disguise. They knew they would only get one chance. The location for the intercept had been chosen days earlier, a narrow ridgeline known to locals as the Knife's Back. It was a treacherous pass, steep drop-offs yawning on either side, the trail winding like a razor's edge. Hikers were forced to slow down, to focus on every step, leaving them exposed. It was a perfect choke point. Once Crow led his clients onto that pass, escape would be impossible. On the morning of the 3rd day, the moment arrived. The team had already moved into position overnight, concealed in the rocks above the trail. 2 undercover officers, dressed convincingly as rangers, descended toward the group. Their uniforms were precise, their demeanor casual. To the untrained eye, they were just park officials performing a routine safety check. Crow didn't flinch when they stopped him. In fact, he smiled warmly, greeting them with that same charisma that had charmed dozens of tourists before. "Morning, Rangers. Everything all right?" His voice was calm, easy. He even reached for his permit before they asked, producing from a waterproof pouch at his side. It was all part of the image, prepared, professional, trustworthy. The Rangers played their roles seamlessly, chatting lightly about recent bear activity, asking to verify permits for compliance purposes. The client stood nearby, adjusting packs, sipping water, oblivious to the tension that coiled beneath the surface. One of the undercover officers turned to Crow with a genial smile. "Mind stepping over here with me for just a minute? Just some paperwork. Shouldn't take long." Crow obliged, following him a few paces down the trail, away from his group. The other ranger subtly positioned himself behind, closing the space. That was the signal. Within seconds, the friendly facade evaporated. Hands gripped Crow's arms, voices sharpened to commands. "Elias Crow, you are under arrest for the disappearance of Claire Hensley." For the first time in days, his composure cracked. His face drained of color, eyes darting wildly from the officers to the cliff's edge, to the stunned faces of his clients. The mountain wind whipped across the ridge, carrying the moment into silence. He tried to pull away, twisting his body, but the officers were faster. His arms were wrenched behind his back, steel cuffs locking into place. He was pinned before he could even think of bolting toward the abyss. The clients froze, wide-eyed, unsure whether this was real or some bizarre mistake. The officers moved quickly, reassuring them with calm, professional voices. "You're safe. Please step back." Crow's charm evaporated in an instant. His words turned sharp, defensive. "This is ridiculous. You don't know what you're doing. I haven't done anything." But the words rang hollow against the cold click of the cuffs and the grim determination of the tactical team. He wasn't in control anymore. Within minutes, the team moved him off the ridge, down to a concealed landing zone where a helicopter waited. The sound of its blades thundered through the valley, drowning out his protests. His clients stood in stunned silence, watching the man they had trusted with their lives being led away like a criminal. The airlift was swift. In less than an hour, Elias Crow was locked inside a secure Denver facility, stripped of the wilderness that had long been his sanctuary. The interrogation room was sterile, deliberately cold. Crow sat at the metal table, his wrists chained, his eyes fixed on a mirror that reflected his image back at him. The swagger was gone, but the defiance lingered in his jaw. Detective Mercer entered with 2 colleagues. He laid a thick file on the table, its spine worn from weeks of handling. He didn't waste time. "Claire Hensley," Mercer began. "We know you crossed paths with her in 2015. We know you frequented the caves where her SD card metadata points. We know about your past, the robbery, the prison sentence. And we know Hannah Cole placed you with Claire at the lodge." Each word was deliberate, like the measured strokes of a hammer against stone. Crow leaned back, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've built a nice little story. But stories don't make me guilty." Mercer slid a photo across the table. It was a degraded gear Ellen Wilder had found, spread across a tarp during evidence processing. Next to it, a still image of the coordinates extracted from the SD card. "You know this place. Don't pretend you don't." Crow's hand twitched ever so slightly. His mask was cracking. The hours dragged on. He denied, deflected, spun half-truths. But Mercer kept pressing, circling back, forcing him to confront every inconsistency. The walls of the room seemed to close in with every question, every piece of evidence laid before him. Crow was a man who thrived in open spaces, with a mountain stretched endlessly. Here, in a box of steel and fluorescent light, he had nowhere to run. Finally, after nearly 12 hours, the silence broke. His smirk faltered, his shoulders sagged. His eyes, one sharp with defiance, dull with the weight of inevitability. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, roughened by exhaustion. "Fine," he muttered. "You want the truth? You'll get it." The room went still. Mercer leaned forward, pen ready. The air was heavy with the realization that, at last, the story of Claire Hensley's disappearance was about to be told. The sterile hum of the interrogation room filled the silence, broken only by the faint scratching of a pen against paper. Elias Crow sat with his shoulders hunched, his hands cuffed in front of him, and his eyes fixed on the table. Hours of denial had chipped away at his defenses until the weight of silence became unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost fragile. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered. Detective Daniel Mercer leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then tell us what did happen." Crow's jaw tightened. He avoided Mercer's eyes, staring instead at the reflection of the overhead light bouncing off the metal tabletop. For a long moment, it seemed like he might retreat back into silence. But then, with a shuddering breath, the words began to flow. She was at the High Timber Lodge. Alone. I'd seen her before. She had that look, sharp, professional, but restless. She came to me, asked if I knew a quiet trail. I said I could show her one. We weren't supposed to meet again, but she came back that evening. Said she didn't want company, but she stayed anyway. We drank. We laughed. It was easy. Too easy. He paused, running his tongue across dry lips. His voice dropped lower, as if the memory itself was dangerous. We hiked the next day. I told her about the cave, one of my spots. She agreed to see it. She trusted me. They always did. Mercer's pen stilled on the page. Crow swallowed hard. In the cave, it was good at first. We talked, got closer. She told me things about pressure at work, about being tired of proving herself. She seemed free for once. And I thought maybe she'd understand me. So I told her the truth. About prison. About the years I lost. I wanted her to see I wasn't just some guide. His voice cracked on the last word. Then his face hardened, the mask of control slipping. But she didn't understand. She froze. Her whole face changed. She looked at me like I was dangerous. Like I was nothing but a criminal. She said she was leaving. Said she didn't feel safe. I begged her to wait, to listen. She tried to push past me. His fists clenched against the cuffs, metal biting into his skin. She slapped me, hard. It stung, and before I could think, I shoved her back, just to make her stop, just for space. But the cave was tight, and she fell. Mercer's eyes narrowed. Fell how? Crow's voice trembled. Her head hit the rock. The sound, I can still hear it. She didn't move. I panicked. I checked her pulse. It was faint, weak. I thought she was gone. I couldn't. His words broke off into a ragged breath. For a moment, the room was silent except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Then Mercer's voice cut through. So you left her there. Crow's shoulders sagged. I ran. I was terrified. A cop dead in my cave? With my record? They'd never believe me. I left her. God help me, I left her. Detective Mercer exchanged a glance with his partner. The story aligned too closely with what they already suspected. The cave, the metadata on the card, the head injury. Still Mercer pressed. Why hide her memory card in her shoe? Crow looked up for the first time, eyes rimmed red. I didn't. She must have done it herself. Maybe after I left. Maybe she woke up. Maybe she tried to leave. He shook his head slowly, as if the thought tormented him. But I wasn't there when she died. I swear. The confession hung heavy in the air, filling every corner of the room with a suffocating weight. It wasn't the kind of neat ending investigators wanted, but it was enough to unravel the mystery. When the tape stopped rolling, Crow slumped in his chair, silent once more. For the first time in years, the case of Officer Claire Hensley had a voice to attach to its shadows. A voice trembling with regret, fear, and the terrible truth of how a single moment of violence had stolen her life. And yet, even as he was led back to his cell, one haunting question remained. Had Crow really told him everything? Or had the wilderness still kept something back, buried deeper than anyone had yet dared to look? The mountains were silent when the search teams returned. A silence not of peace, but of waiting. Elias Crow's confession had given investigators their first real map to follow. Somewhere between the hidden cave and the place where Claire's gear had been discovered lay the truth, the last steps of her life. Specialized cadaver dogs were deployed, their handlers moving carefully along treacherous ridges, and through valleys no casual hiker would ever attempt. The terrain was brutal. Loose rock, sudden drops, dense undergrowth that clawed at boots and tore at sleeves. Every step reminded the team that this was a place built to swallow secrets. For hours they combed the wilderness. They traced faint game trails, searched shaded gullies, and circled the cave Crow had described. Just as the fatigue began to set in, one of the dogs froze, nose pressed to the ground. A low whine broke the stillness. The handler called out. They had found something. Wedged beneath a massive rock overhang, shielded from wind, rain, and the eyes of passers-by, lay the skeletal remains of a human body. The bones were discolored, worn by time, yet arranged in a way that told the story of collapse. Her boots were still on. Her jacket, shredded by weather, clung to what little was left of her frame. And in that moment, silence broke. The mountain had given her back. Detective Daniel Mercer stood with his team, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. For so long, Claire Hensley had been a name on a missing persons list, a photograph fading on a bulletin board. Now, she was real again, though in the most devastating way. The forensic crew worked with reverence, documenting everything before carefully lifting the remains. They noted the fracture at the back of her skull, a break consistent with a violent fall. It matched Crow's account of her head, striking the cave stone. But there was something more. Her position suggested she had traveled after the injury. She had not died immediately. This revelation tore at the investigators. It meant Claire had been conscious, even briefly. She had tried to survive. Perhaps she had crawled to the forest, fighting against confusion, blood loss, and the creeping cold of night. Maybe she had pulled herself beneath that overhang, hoping for shelter, clinging to life with every ounce of training and grit she had. And before she succumbed, she had hidden her final evidence, the memory card. It was an act of clarity amid fading strength, the last decision of a dying officer determined to leave behind her story. When the remains were transported out of the mountains, the entire search team fell into silence. Helicopter blades cut through the air, carrying her home, but their hearts remained heavy. They had solved the mystery, yes, but solving it had cost them something, a haunting reminder that the wilderness takes more than it ever gives back. The news reached her parents first. Martha and Jeremy Hensley opened their door to uniformed officers, their faces pale with the weight of what they carried. Martha's knees buckled before a word was even spoken. Jeremy caught her, his own face breaking into the quiet devastation of a father who had feared this day for years. Closure was supposed to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like the world had ended twice. At the press conference, officials laid out the facts. Remains confirmed as Officer Claire Hensley, cause of death consistent with blunt force trauma and exposure, confession obtained from Elias Crow, case officially closed. But behind the podium, Mercer's voice carried something unspoken. He knew the public wanted justice in clean lines and clear answers. Yet what lingered was the image of a woman fighting through pain, alone in the wilderness, determined to be found even when she knew she might not survive. Crow, when told of the discovery, wept, not the tears of innocence, but of inevitability. His guilt, once hidden behind charm and bravado, was laid bare. He had not swung a weapon or planned a murder, but in one moment of violence, one shove born of anger, he had set a chain of events into motion that ended in death. And though he confessed, though the remains confirmed his story, there was something chilling that could not be ignored. He had walked away. He had left her. He had chosen self-preservation over compassion. That choice was his crime, his mark, his burden to carry until the end of his days. The public followed every detail with fascination and sorrow. News outlets replayed the timeline. Photos of Claire in uniform, images of the wilderness where she was lost. Her story became a symbol of the fragility of life, the cruelty of chance, and the dangerous mix of trust and betrayal. But for her family, it wasn't a story. It was the empty chair at the dinner table, the unopened letters she would never read, the echo of laughter that would never again fill their home. And for the investigators who had chased her trail for years, the discovery did not bring peace. It only deepened the mystery of why some people live and others vanish, why a single decision can ripple outward until it consumes everything. As night fell on the mountains once more, the cave where it all began returned to silence. The trees swayed, the wind whispered against the stone, and the shadows deepened. Claire's voice was gone, but the wilderness still held her story in its roots, in its rocks, in the silence that would forever haunt those who had sought her. The trial of Elias Crow unfolded like a story the public had already read, yet one they couldn't look away from. The courtroom was crowded, the air heavy with the gaze of journalists, grieving parents, and officers who had once called Claire Hensley a colleague. Crow sat at the defense table, thinner now, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own words. His confession had left little room for doubt. The charge was not premeditated murder, but manslaughter, an acknowledgement that while he hadn't planned to kill Claire, his violence and his decision to abandon her had ensured she would never come home alive. As the prosecution laid out the evidence, the recovered remains, the fractured skull, the memory card hidden in her shoe, every detail felt like a wound reopened. Photos of the cave, diagrams of the terrain, even a faint outline of Claire's boot prints traced by forensic experts painted the picture of her final hours. Her parents, Martha and Jeremy, sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together. When the memory card was played aloud, its shaky video capturing Claire's desperate attempt to document her situation, the courtroom fell into silence. Her voice, faint but determined, spoke of pain, of fear, of betrayal. But there was strength in it too, the strength of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Crow couldn't lift his eyes from the table as the recording played. For once, his charm, his bravado, the persona he'd built to mask his past, all crumbled. He was no longer a guide, no longer a storyteller of the wild. He was the man who had walked away. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, one that would likely consume the remainder of his life. But even as the gavel struck, the courtroom did not erupt in triumph. There was no applause, no satisfaction, only the heavy awareness that no sentence could return what had been lost. For Martha and Jeremy, justice was a word, not a bomb. Their daughter's absence lingered in every quiet corner of their lives. Birthdays passed without her. Holidays arrived with her chair forever empty. And yet, they held on to something else, a pride that she had fought until the very end, that she had left behind the truth in the most unlikely place, ensuring that her voice would be heard even from the silence of the wilderness. Detective Daniel Mercer retired a year after the trial, his career defined not by promotions or accolades, but by the case of Claire Hensley. He often visited the mountains where she had disappeared, standing at the trailhead as if expecting her to walk out, smiling, alive. Each time, the air carried the same weight, as though the wilderness itself remembered. The cave where she fell became a place of pilgrimage for some, a grim landmark marked only by whispers among hikers. Some avoided it altogether, claiming the air felt colder there, the silence heavier. Others left small tokens, flowers, notes, a badge pinned to the rock. And yet, the wilderness went on as it always had. Trees grew, snow fell, the wind carved the stone a little deeper. Nature did not care for grief or justice. It simply endured, keeping its secrets until someone forced them into the light. Claire's story lived on, not just in court records or headlines, but in the haunting reminder of how quickly trust can turn fatal, how fragile the line is between solitude and danger. She had been a police officer, trained and prepared, yet even she could not outrun the weight of betrayal in a place where help was miles away. Her memory card, with its faint recording, became part of police training across the state, a chilling example of survival instinct and evidence preservation. Recruits listened to her words in quiet rooms, the lights dimmed, and felt the gravity of what it meant to serve, to fight, and to be remembered. And in the years that followed, whenever a hiker vanished in the mountains, when families clung to hope and officers traced faint trails, someone would inevitably whisper her name. Claire Hensley, the officer who disappeared, the woman who refused to vanish without leaving a trace. In the end, it was not the wilderness that defined her story. It was her refusal to be silenced by it. But as the last echoes of her voice faded, one truth lingered in the shadows of the pines and the silence of the stone. The wilderness remembers, even when we wish to forget.